So today, the title of the sermon is Words for the Wise. Now you might wonder why I have wise in quotation marks there. Well, you're going to find out that there's a lot of times in human history where mankind and men think they're wise, think they know it all, think they have all the answers. And we're going to find out that a lot of times they don't. That a lot of times they actually are so wrong that it's worse than what they thought. So the question of the day is, where do we find wisdom? Where does wisdom come from? What is the beginning of wisdom? Go ahead and go to the next slide. We're going to go through a little history lesson. Anyone who listens to me on the show knows I love history. So, a little history lesson today. This is a painting of Socrates, the Greek philosopher Socrates. Now, Socrates thought he had the answer for the beginning of wisdom. The story goes that he visited an oracle. And they asked this oracle, who is the wisest person in existence? Who is the wisest man out there? And the oracle said, well, you are, Socrates. You're the wisest man. And Socrates was a little confused. He's like, but I don't know anything. I don't know. I know nothing, he would say. And it took him a little while to figure it out. But he realized that maybe that's what made him wise, was admitting that he knew nothing. Because he would talk to other people who thought they knew it all, and it found out that they didn't know it all. So Socrates believed, that the beginning of wisdom was admitting you don't know anything. Now, I actually don't think that is the true beginning of wisdom, but I do think that he has a point. That maybe mankind, women, would be a lot better off if we had actually admit maybe we don't know everything. So let's travel through history. Go to the next slide. Now, some of you might know what this is. These statues were found outside the tomb of Qin Shi Huang. I'm probably saying that wrong, I'm sorry, but he was known as the first Chinese emperor of the Qin dynasty. The first Chinese emperor. Very powerful man. And they found these statues outside his tomb, and they actually have never excavated the actual tomb because it's considered sacred and the Chinese won't let them do it. But they found a lot of these statues outside the tomb. And what's amazing about the statues is each statue of a soldier, it's different. All of them look different. And they found dozens of these. And they found a statue of a chariot and horses and all that stuff. And the reason why all of those statues were out there is he thought it would protect him in the afterlife. So after he died, he would go into the afterlife, and all his soldiers would protect him so he could have sort of eternal life in the afterlife. But before that, believe it or not, Emperor Qin believed, well, he didn't believe, he had an obsession with trying to live forever. He had this obsession of, I want to have eternal life here on earth. I want to live forever. I'm going to be the first man ever to live forever. So what he did is he started practicing what is known as alchemy. And this was Chinese alchemy, a specific kind of alchemy. And they would make these special Chinese elixirs. And he would take them and believe by drinking this stuff, eating this stuff, he would live forever. Well, it turns out that in the alchemy, in these elixirs that he would make, it turns out that there was mercury in it. Now, if you know what mercury will do to you, it will kill you. It's a poison. So in his quest for living forever, he was killing himself. It's amazing how much we think we know. Go to the next slide. Now, what is this funny looking guy up here? It looks like a bird or something. This is a drawing of what's called a plague doctor. Or they called them beak doctors too, because they had these long beak things. And what happens is people, nurses and doctors at the time, during the bubonic plague, would wear these outfits because they didn't want to catch the bubonic plague in Europe at the time when it was spreading throughout Europe. So they would wear these outfits so they wouldn't catch the plague. Interesting thing about the bubonic plague. At the time, people thought that if they bought certain spices, and they would either burn it in their house, or they would put it around their house, certain different kind of spices, it would kind of clean the air around them, around their home. And that by having these spices around their home, they wouldn't catch the plague. Everyone is dying around them, and they think, well, I'm not going to catch the plague, so I'm going to buy these spices. But what happened is, where did those spices come from? Well, a lot of times they were shipped from other countries. You know what were on these ships that had all these spices that were traveling all over Europe to stop the bubonic plague? The plague. The plague, as you know, was spread by fleas that were on rats. Rats were known to be on these ships, on these trading ships. So the trading ships would go from country to country, and the rats would be from one country. They'd have the plague fleas on them. They'd go to another country. The rats would go out into the country, off the boat, and spread the plague. So they thought by buying all these spices, they were curing themselves from the plague. Turns out, once again, they were actually spreading the disease more. It's amazing how much we think we know. The wisest people at the time thought this, and they were wrong. Go ahead and go to the next slide. A little bit forward into history, you might wonder what this drawing is of. This drawing was supposed to be a rendering of what was supposed to be called the Palace of the Soviets. The Soviet Union, Russia, became this dictatorship state, the socialist state. And what they did actually at the time, they believed, they didn't believe in religion, they believed in communism, and communism was an atheist belief at the time. And they didn't believe in any kind of religion. So there was actually a big cathedral at this site. They tore down the cathedral, and they were going to build this Palace of the Soviets, and that's supposed to be Lenin at the top. And it's supposed to be one of the biggest buildings in the world. Well, as you know, the Soviet Union collapsed. They believed at the time that they had the right economic system, that they had the right system for a country, that communism and socialism would work for a country, and that they could build these huge buildings and make the best country in the world. Well, it turns out that that kind of system doesn't work, because a government cannot know everything, cannot know everybody's wants and needs, and cannot take care of everyone. It doesn't work. A dictatorship doesn't work. So eventually the Soviet Union, because they were building big buildings like this, although they never built this never got done, this building. Because they were building big buildings and a huge military, but didn't have bread for their people, the system collapsed. By the way, where this was supposed to be, they rebuilt that cathedral. So this building never got built, but that cathedral that they tore down was rebuilt and still exists there in Russia today. Jesus had the final say there. But it's amazing how much we think we know. Let's go a little bit more in the future. This is a picture of Albert Einstein, and that's Edwin Hubble in the middle. Now, Albert Einstein, you might know, had the theory of relativity. But Albert Einstein was convinced, remember, this is the smartest guy on the planet at the time. You know, everyone compares himself with a really smart. They say you're an Einstein, even today. Well, Albert Einstein was convinced that the universe had always existed and was always the same size as it is today. It was always as big as it was today, and it wasn't moving, it wasn't expanding, it wasn't contracting. Even though his theory kind of proved that it would, he was convinced, no, the universe is eternal, it's existed this size, and it always will exist at this size. Smartest guy at the time, right? Well, the man in the middle, Edwin Hubble, he built, he had this huge telescope, and he would study the stars, and he would study the galaxies. And he realized something. That because of something called a redshift, he realized, basically proved, that the universe was expanding. Because if you look through a certain prism, a certain lens, you could see that all the stars were expanding outward because it would leave behind what's called a redshift. So he basically proved that Albert Einstein, the smartest person in the planet at the time, was wrong. This is a picture of Albert Einstein looking at his telescope and realizing he's wrong. It's amazing how much we think we know. Go to the next slide. Here we go. 1972, Newsweek came out with a big article, big spread that said, the scientists know that we are heading into another ice age. The world is cooling. We have to prepare for the coming ice age. They were all convinced of this, the smartest people at the time. Newsweek. Everyone believes in Newsweek. And you look at that, and it's funny. I don't hear that anymore. Does anyone hear? I actually usually hear the opposite now, that the world is warming. But at the time, scientists, the top scientists at the time, believed that the world was freezing. It's amazing how much we think we know. So where does wisdom come from? Well, we're going to read from John chapter 9, starting with verse 13. We're going to hear from the people in Israel at the time, the Pharisees. The Pharisees were like a lot of those other people we just mentioned throughout history. They believed that they were the smartest people of the day, that they had the answers. You know, they studied the law, the Jewish law, and they added a lot of their own man-made traditions as well. And they thought highly of themselves. They thought they knew all the answers. They thought they were better than everyone else, and they thought they were wiser than everyone else. But you'll soon realize that they were not. That they did not truly understand where the beginning of wisdom comes from. So this is shortly after Jesus healed a man born blind. There's a man born blind, and he had the man get water and clay and put it on his eyes. And this man was healed. Never had seen before in his life. And was healed. So the story got spread around. And the Pharisees wanted to investigate this because they didn't like Jesus. No, Jesus is a sinner, you see. There's no way he could have healed this person. This guy must be lying. Bring him here. We'll investigate. We'll see what happened. How has this man born blind been able to see? So this is starting with verse 13 of John chapter 9. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been born blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was the Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Pretty simple. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. Now, why did they say he didn't keep the Sabbath? Because he healed on the Sabbath. This man was born blind, happened to be on the Sabbath, and he went and healed him. And you would think the Pharisees would be astonished that would be the reaction, that who is this man that can heal the blind? You'd think that would have been their reaction. No, their reaction was to criticize him because he healed on the Sabbath. Now, as Jesus responded to them, he's the Lord of the Sabbath, and gave them a little history as well on how it's okay to heal and do good on the Sabbath. The Pharisees didn't care about that. They just wanted to prove Jesus wrong some way because they were threatened. Because if Jesus was who he said he was, they were not the wisest people at the time. So I'll start from verse 16 again. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, "How can a sinner perform such signs?" So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. "What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened." The man replied, "He is a prophet." It's a pretty understandable response. But the Pharisees didn't like that response. They still did not believe that he had been born blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. Imagine that. This guy had been born blind, and the Pharisees were so desperate to prove him wrong. We're going to get his parents. We're going to get some witness here. Bring the next witness. And they asked the parents, "Is this your son?" They asked, "Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see?" Now the parents' response is pretty interesting. They were afraid as well. Starting with verse 20. "We know he is our son," the parents answered, "and we know he was born blind. But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." Can you imagine being this guy? It's like his parents say, "Oh, well, you don't know." "Thanks, Mom." "Thanks, Dad. Appreciate it." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, who already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That was why his parents said, "He is of age, ask him." So they didn't want to be, when you're put out of the synagogue, you're excommunicated. You couldn't do any of the worship practices at the time. And they didn't want to be excommunicated. They needed the synagogue. They needed to look as good people of the community. By the way, Jesus predicted this, that some families would be separated by his name. That mother would be against daughter, father against son, because of my name. Because Jesus was here to proclaim the truth. And some people didn't want to hear the truth. Continue on with verse 24. A second time they summoned the man who had been born blind. They were not giving up. "Give glory to God by telling the truth," they said. "We know this man is a sinner." He replied, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see." This guy born blind, he's probably not a religious scholar or anything. Probably didn't keep all the commandments the way he should, or the Jewish law the way he should, like the Pharisees. Didn't know everything the Pharisees knew. The Pharisees, like I said, they thought they were experts of the law. Their obsession was the law. So they're asking him all these questions, trying to trip him up, prove that Jesus isn't who he said he was. And the guy's like, "Look, all I know is I was blind, and now I see. What more evidence do you need than that?" Now the Pharisees weren't done, though. Then they asked him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered, "I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too?" Oh, the Pharisees did not like that one. No way. What do you mean? Well, first off, it's kind of showing that this man would become a disciple of Jesus. Not one of the 12 apostles, but a disciple, a follower of Jesus. So already this guy who was born blind can now see, saying, "I'm going to follow Jesus over you guys." The Pharisees didn't like that part. But they also definitely didn't like the idea that maybe they would become followers of Jesus. What? We're not going to follow Jesus. We're the wise ones. We're the smart ones. We're not going to follow that sinner who doesn't keep the Sabbath. Then they hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. They said this to Jesus once too, by the way. That, we're followers of Moses. Some people said that to Jesus. And Jesus said, before Moses was, I am. Saying that he is God. I am what I am. I am who I am. The Pharisees didn't like that then, and they didn't like this now. Continue on to verse 30. The man answered, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Now that's very true what he said there. And nowhere in the Old Testament does it mention somebody healing a man born blind. Nowhere. This doesn't happen. Nobody can do that. But Jesus did it. And this person who was healed was like, this is remarkable. How can you not know who this guy is? How can you not know where this guy comes from? He healed me and I was born blind. What more do you need to know? And he basically says it there. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Meaning Jesus wouldn't be able to heal him like he did if he were not from God. To this they replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. Who was the wise one in this situation? I think you all know. The Pharisees thought they were the wise one. They had all their legalistic reasons. He didn't keep the Sabbath. We don't even know where he's from. We know of Moses. You're a sinner. You can't know this about someone. You're a sinner. They thought they knew. It's amazing what we think we know. But this man, the man healed, he was the wise one. He was the wise one because he recognized the real truth that was right in front of all of their faces. Plain as day for anyone to see. That Jesus is God. That he is who he said he was. The Son of God, God incarnate. And that if he was not from God, he wouldn't have been able to do these things. So the Pharisees thought they knew where wisdom came from. They thought it came from the law. They thought it came from their own power, their own traditions. But the man healed knew where wisdom comes from. Where wisdom comes from. Go ahead to, I believe I had Proverbs 9, verse 10. Go ahead. This is where true wisdom comes from. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Wisdom comes from fearing God. Now, the word fear here in this context comes from the Hebrew word yirah, which means reverential fear and awe of him. And it basically means an understanding of who God is, that he's all powerful, that he's all knowing, that he is all loving, that he's above everything and what he can do in our daily lives. And fearing him is following him in your daily life, is understanding him. The Pharisees thought they understood the law, but they didn't understand one thing that was in Proverbs, that the fear of God, the fear of the Lord, is the beginning of wisdom. They didn't fear God. They didn't put God first. They put themselves first. But the man born blind and was healed, he truly feared God. He knew what God was capable of. He knew that only one of God could heal like Jesus did. He might not have known all the other legalistic things the Pharisees knew. Might not have been as smart as the Pharisees. But he knew. Go ahead and go to the next verse. Romans, I believe I have it, right? Romans chapter 1, verse 21 through 23. This is Paul talking in the book of Romans. He talks about wisdom as well. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. When Paul, and I would encourage you to go back to Romans and read full chapter 1. Paul's talking about there is when you look at creation, when you look at God's creation, any wise person could see where all that comes from. It comes from God, the God of the Bible. But there were pagans at the times, fools at the times, who didn't want to believe that. They would rather worship their own man-made stuff. And Paul was telling them they were fools. The wise one fears God first. The biggest lesson we can learn from this is we live in a world today, a culture today, where a lot of people think they're wise, think they're smart, but they're not. Our culture today tells you you're stupid if you believe someone rose from the dead after 3 days after being crucified. What are you dumb? Our culture says, what, you believe that this creation was created? You believe the Genesis story? You believe that book? How could you believe that? The so-called smart people of the day are going to tell you you're stupid if you believe those things. And even though most people today say they believe in God, the culture is changing more every day, it seems like, towards the other direction. Where you are going to be persecuted, maybe not physically harmed or anything, but just made fun of and stuff for believing and fearing God. Well, just remember that Jesus talked about this. The Bible talks about this. And this isn't the first time it's happened in history. Just remember that while they think they're smart, while the world might think it's smart and knows everything, you have true wisdom if you believe and fear God. And if you believe and fear Jesus Christ. And you believe the Bible and what it says about Jesus. That he was God, that he is God, that he came down to earth as a man, that he performed the miraculous signs, that he died on the cross for our sins, and that he rose on the third day and ascended into heaven. That is wisdom. It's amazing how much man thinks they know, but you know the truth. That's where wisdom comes from.